Hey friend, welcome to Authentic Performance, the podcast. My name is Nat and I'm your host. At Authentic Performance, our mission is to provide education and advocacy for all athletes, developing awareness surrounding identity, purpose, and health, so athletes can live well beyond their sport. This week, I had the opportunity to talk to Sile Walsh. Shila's background is in coaching psychology and organizational development, with over a decade of experience working with clients in Ireland and internationally. I had the pleasure of working with her this summer during an internship abroad, and I learned so much. Sheila is especially passionate about inclusive leadership, and we got to discuss how this topic can apply to a sports perspective. This is such an informative conversation about psychological safety, inclusive leadership, and sport from a societal lens. I know you're going to be encouraged and challenged from what Sheila has to say. Now here's Sheila. Okay, I'm so excited to have Sile Walsh here today. I met Sheila this summer. I actually had the opportunity of interning for her. So I'm really excited to get to talk about what she does and how we can kind of apply that to sports. So Sheila, thank you for being here, and I would love to give you a chance to just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Natalie. I had the pleasure of having you intern with me this past summer, and I was delighted to hear you were doing the podcast because we had so many conversations about women, sports, performance, teams, and it was fantastic. So it's great to be here. So thank you, and well done for setting up the podcast and moving forward with it. Well impressed. So I suppose my name is Sheila. It's spelt funny because it's spelt in the Irish way. I'm based in Ireland, which is where Natalie came and joined me for the summer. And I specialise in inclusive leadership, but I do come from a very particular background of coaching psychology and organisational development. So I think a lot about performance, psychological safety, inclusion as almost a bedfellows, that they happen together. They're not separate things. If we separate them out, we get some challenges that arise. And I've been working with organizations for over 12 years now in different capacities to help them build kind of inclusive, high performing, psychologically safe environments and teams so that performance can occur on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, that's kind of it. Is there something in particular you think I should mention, Natalie, from just talking previously?
No, I think just maybe a little bit about what it looks like for you to be a leadership coach. What does that like daily look like for you?
Brilliant. It's really interesting because prior to COVID, I would say I spent a lot of time in traffic and a lot of time flying. And my day-to-day moved from meetings to actual coaching sessions to development programs, so development workshops or mass classes. Since COVID, I have loads of traveling, but thankfully not as much traffic because most people, we only travel if it's full day's work or it's a really significant intervention. And most of the leaders I'm working with are really busy and they don't have time to sit in traffic. So therefore, they save me the traffic. So my week looks like usually starting around 8 a.m. and on different days, some days I finish at 9:30 or 10 p.m. just simply because I'm lecturing in the evenings or I'm unfortunately writing up a report based on another intervention. But I'm not working 8 to 10 every day. And then the majority of my day moves between working one-on-one online or with groups online and one-on-one in person with clients in Dublin, but also going to different countries and working in different countries with leadership teams or individual leaders. I have some really great kind of partners and collaborators who I do also get to meet with to kind of develop different ideas and approaches and pieces like that. But I spend a lot of time with people talking or listening, and a lot of time thinking about systemic and strategic impact. So not just thinking about the problem that's being presented, but thinking about the intended and unintended consequences. So a lot of reflective practice. Every couple of weeks, I sit with a supervisor who we talk about my practice and we think about how I got in the way, how I can be more effective. Reluctantly, I often have to clean the house, which is not really my favorite task, but I definitely try to read something new or listen to something inspiring every day, because as an independent practitioner, we kind of end up in rooms where we're bringing something, and sometimes we can get stuck in our own stuff. So you'd find me at quite a few development masterclasses or workshops, or listen to podcasts or reading books. Yeah, that's kind of what it looks like.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's so cool. For me personally, when I first like applied for the internship and then kind of got to learn more about what you do, I was like, wow, this is so cool how much it applies to what I want to do as well. So, just in general, we'll go more in depth later, but what are some of the ways that we can apply the techniques that you're using, especially with like inclusive leadership with businesses, to an athletic sense? How does that
Mm.
transfer over a little bit?
So I think the best place to start is to know that coaching and that type of approach emerged from multiple different professions, one of which was sports psychology, or sports, before sports psychology had a place. So we share some very fundamental things around strengths focused performance. Um, when I think about athletes, I think about professional sports, and when I've worked with professional sports people, and we're thinking about what translates from, we'll say, maybe the corporate organizational inclusive leadership lens into the settings that they're in. The first thing is, from a leadership perspective, we know that inclusive leadership is required in sports organizations. We've seen that in the news over the last number of months and years, where we've seen massive issues because of a lack of understanding of effective leadership within a global context, where it's being viewed beyond your cultural norm or your sports norms. So we know that actually we need critical thinkers in sports, and for athletes to understand that it goes beyond. They need to consider their practice and their development beyond what they need to do to win, or how to prevent losing. Because when they don't do that, we see other things happen, such as people burning out. We see that people lose their identity when they move away from their sports, or and so we know that if we're only cultivating sports professionals through the lens of sports and not including other aspects of their identity, ultimately we end up exploiting sports professionals and leaving them to deal with those consequences when that identity is no longer something that they can engage with because of age, or because of skills, or because their desires in life have changed. So that's one thing. It's very relevant because we see the impact of it not being kind of central. And then I think there's further nuances when we understand inclusion, not just from a societal lens, because inclusion from a societal lens is talked about and advocated, and activists are very active in that, but thinking about inclusion in terms of performance and how that helps with performance. And that's kind of one of the good things about organizational inclusion, is it gets us to think about inclusion within a context rather than just within a societal view. And while I believe in societal inclusion, that does not translate into organizations, and also doesn't translate into sports very effectively sometimes. So one of the things I think is really transferable, and this is maybe just for the average athlete, the average sports person, is to realize that the whole area of sports that you perform in, and the assumptions about what is good, what is best practice, what success looks like, is built on foundations that are ultimately not inclusive. And that isn't to say you shouldn't be involved in the sports, or we should scrap everything, but you need to know that there are nuances that are holding different people back for different reasons. And that's something to consider. One of the key examples I have, actually, and I really love this one, is somebody said to me once, right, you're talking about inclusion, but you're talking about basically cultivating people to be more inclusive, i.e. going against their evolutionary process. I thought, oh, that's interesting. You see it as against evolutionary process. But then they said, which was really interesting, was, well, look, humans are the smartest species. How are we getting this so wrong? And I was like, slow that down. What is your assumption that we're the smartest species? So what's this assumption, which is what we build a lot of things on, is these unconscious assumptions. We kill the most of our own species. We kill the most other species. We create the most global issues in terms of global warming. Like, we may be successful in some measurements of what you think successful species looks like, But actually, if you look at other elements, you would realize we really are not the smartest species, in those areas. And I think sometimes that's a good analogy to think about sports. We can say, and I had this conversation, my brother's really into sports. We have really good conversations about the relationship with identity, sports, performance. And people can say, yeah, well, the best person does the job, and the best person gets it. And then you start to unpick what makes them the best, who decided that was the best, how are you developing the best, what measurements are you using, what advice are you giving, who was that designed for, what is that based on? And suddenly your assumption of the best starts to crumble a little bit. And that's not to say that we should throw out some of these standards. I think they're really helpful, but we need to question the assumption that these standards are actually the measurement of the best, rather than questioning if we are measuring things that we've deemed as meaning that somebody's the best, rather than thinking about other ways of measuring it. Like one of the key examples, I don't know if you saw recently, but there was a piece of research about women's soccer, that there's evidence that women are getting more ankle injuries than men are in soccer. And the research basically points to the fact that nobody went out of their way to create soccer shoes that wouldn't be suitable for women's feet. Nobody did that. Nobody's like out to get women or anything. Well, they might be, but not in this case, not in these examples. What happened was there was a social norm that men played sports that was privileged, that was centered. Women weren't allowed to play sports. The equipment that was designed for women for soccer was designed around the male body. And now we've only just discovered in 2023 that we've been injuring women simply because we haven't considered that the shape of a woman's foot might be different, and therefore the shape of the football shoe needs to be different. And that is a really key example about the assumption that a shoe is the same on both bodies, the assumption that men's feet are the norm for sports based on societal influences, which actually later then disadvantage women from being effective, having more skill, like all of those things. And I think that sometimes when we talk about inclusion in sports, people get into political, and I don't even want to bring it up because I don't even want to discuss some of the topics, but they get into these examples which are trying to prove a point. I think the point is, if you're really into sports, if you're really into athletics, then your commitment to the best should go beyond your comfort with these assumptions. And actually, if you really are a sports person and you really are thinking about competition and performance, then you go beyond kind of trying to brush away this conversation and you say, oh my God, maybe we are limiting what the best looks like. Maybe we need to set up a scene where actually we get better competition, more nuanced, more skill, rather than just assuming that the kind of foundations we're working off are good enough and that's it, because maybe we don't agree with all the narratives around inclusion. I would say if you believe that you're a sports person and you believe in competition, you believe in the skill and the art, then it's really important that you go beyond the assumption that inclusion is just a political agenda and actually see that it's directly related to performance and directly related to the development of skill within whatever area you're interested in. And I understand those things, not as a very good sports person, although I won an All-Ireland medal once, and this is my pride, right? Because I won it when I was 11, and I was in a goal playing Irish football, and I'm really bad at it, and they only put me in the goal because we were short someone, but I won a medal, and so that's the nearest I've got to being a sports person. So you can see that what I'm pointing to, while it is relevant to sports, it is really coming from understanding inclusion in organisations, and the purpose of including people for organisations is actually about organisational performance, really. And the same needs to be for sports. It needs to be about helping diversify how we think about success and how we develop the capacity for sports people to perform. That's the point. It's meant to make it better. It's not about a political position or agenda or ideology. It's really about asking those questions so that you can actually improve and strengthen your area, your sports interest, and that we can evolve it maybe beyond some unscientific, unhelpful assumptions.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that you mentioned the football cleats, because I just talked to someone else. She's a sports journalist, or science and sports journalist, so she looks at a lot of the science and biological aspects of females and how that translates to sports. And that's a perfect example of like the standard being set for males and then expecting females to be able to, perform in the same capacity, but not providing the same opportunity necessarily because there's that barrier. So I think that's a really important aspect, and even just considering inclusive leadership as this performance driver, because that's something that I think so many coaches are interested in, is improving performance. And that's, I think, why uh, performance in sports psychology is gaining traction now, is that people are seeing the actual impact that it has, instead of just, oh, this is just another thing that people are trying to push on us. It's something that actually has research backed results. So I would love for you to give us a little bit more information. We've been talking about inclusive leadership and inclusivity. What is inclusive leadership and why is it important?
Okay, so I suppose lots of people have different ideas about it. So I'm going to give you the definition that I have coming from the research that I've been doing for my PhD and also being on the ground with people. Inclusive leadership is a leadership approach that facilitates belonging and uniqueness. So considers, how do I help these people feel that they have a place here, and also that they can be themselves to the degree that's required. But it's also for formal and informal leadership. So it's not just about official leadership titles. Leadership, if you think about that term, is directly related to followership. How can you lead if you don't have a follower? And so inclusive leadership is about facilitating belonging and uniqueness at any level that anybody is in. So whether you are the most junior person in the room or the most senior, that you are facilitating that in how you influence and lead people. And so I think that's kind of the central piece. But I would also say, which can get missed in some diversity and inclusion approaches, is that the purpose of inclusive leadership is to improve the performance of your organization, at least in organizational settings. If inclusive leadership isn't about helping your people, your team, and your organization perform, then you're doing something else, because there's no point in leading in a work setting if you're not contributing to the purpose of that work. And if I was to transfer it a little bit to a sports kind of setting, the belonging piece is a little bit like whether you are male or female, regardless of your race, regardless of your sexuality, regardless of your religious identity, that you belong in this team, that we all put on the same jersey, or we all represent the same brand. So that's the belonging part. The uniqueness in that setting then is, Natalie, you train according to your menstrual cycle. Paul trains according to their energy or their ADHD or their autistic needs. It's not, and that's just identity. Or it might go a step further. It might be, well, Natalie, you really love training in the mornings, but Paul really loves training at night. And so we accommodate what helps you to have optimal performance, as opposed to thinking that there is one right way. So I think that's the transference to that setting. And then in terms of, the benefits of it, the purpose, look, ultimately, a couple of things from a market point of view, because we're more and more global in all facets of the world. Now we're in contact globally, daily, we're online, we need to know how to include different points of view. Otherwise, we're going to get more of this polarization that we see in political setups. And look, it's, as long as you're polarized and you refuse to listen to the other side, then you're busy arguing with the other side rather than creating the outcomes that you probably secretly both want, but have different ways of creating. So it's about getting cooperation. It's also about knowing that, assuming that there are standardized ways of performing, that actually you limit performance that way. So assuming that everyone needs to train the same way or behave the same way actually stops us performing. So that gets in the way all the time when we're not inclusive and considerate of that. And then I suppose the research around inclusive leadership is it helps innovation, creativity. There are links in private organizations to the business case, as in profit. But while we know it's aligned, there's a couple of nuances we haven't really looked at. Like, we can't really pinpoint how it got from A to B, let's say. But we do know that the influence is measurable. And I suppose, in my mind, inclusive leadership is acknowledging that you don't know everything about everyone, and that your idea about how people should perform and be might be a bigger issue than actually what they need. And if we can focus a little bit more on what do people need to perform, and that's whether you're training, whether you're in an organization, whether you're running a kindergarten, what do these people need to succeed today? That's really the purpose of inclusive leadership. That's the ultimate question. Um, and then there are some nuances, obviously, because of societal issues and because of internalized oppression and external oppression, that you might have to bring awareness to things through it. But ultimately, that's based on what people need to thrive and succeed, rather than based on everyone should know everything about every possible um, ism or phobia that exists.
Yeah. And we've talked about performance just a little bit, but what are some ways that you see having this approach and kind of changing that leadership style to have on performance? What's the impact there?
Brilliant. So one I've only seen actually in the last week, not only seen, but like it came up again in the last week, is if we're not utilizing inclusive leadership, we can do some other things with power, which result in unnecessary responsibility in the wrong places. So people are taking responsibility who don't have the capacity to change it, or people are trying to make decisions, but they don't have a broader view of the decision. So it means that people are getting kind of bogged down by additional responsibility that might not be theirs, and they may not have the power to change. The other thing that it does is it stops teams being distracted by defenses, either individuals or groups. If you are marginalized in any way, if you've had any experience of being the other, then whenever you're engaging with other people, you're really alert to these signals. And an inclusive leader is basically lowering that so that you're not having to be hyper alert to it. You're not having to be defensive, but also as a team, you spend less time in that defensive, figuring things out, competing, relationship struggles, and more time on the thing you're meant to be doing, i.e., improving your performance. The third thing is the creativity and the innovation. And we know this is the strongest thing aligned with inclusive leadership. And the evidence is just again and again reiterating. When you use inclusive leadership and you are dealing with problems that are repetitive, it means that your previous solutions were probably inadequate, badly fitted, not appropriate, wrong, bad timing, any of those things. Inclusive leadership allows you to leave enough room to look for other solutions that you may not be considering. And that can help people solve problems they spent years fighting with. Like I often work with organizations and they'll say, I'll have to do focus groups or debriefs, or I'll have to do facilitated sessions. And people will say, it's a hard crowd. It's a hard crowd. And I often I used to think, oh, it's going to be a hard crowd. What am I going to do? But when I get in there, what I realize is it's a hard crowd if you aren't listening to their unmet needs, because usually people are telling you what they need, but they might not be telling you very well because they might be frustrated, they might not have the language, they have other stuff going on they're afraid to tell you. Inclusive leadership allows you to actually find the solutions you need, but it does require a little time up front so that later you don't have to stop. So what I say, it's like we all look at the map together, we have a conversation about it. People are like, oh, we could just start walking and then look at the map. Look at the map first, have the conversation, work out what concerns are there. And once you start moving, you just gain momentum, which then improves performance, but it also improves the speed at which you access things. So often the barrier is people are afraid. Inclusive leadership takes a lot of time because it does up front. But if you look at the scope of the work you're doing, it doesn't. It just is required up front. Whereas most of the time, we spend a lot more time fixing, rerouting, re-influencing, discovering. So yeah, they're the kind of three main ways that I think has a direct impact on performance. And also just for anyone
Yeah.
listening, if you feel unsafe, you're not focused on performance. Inclusive leadership is a way for you to actually just say the things you need and for that to be incorporated into automatically how you're engaged with, rather than it being a special request or anything extra.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting just to consider the role, especially that coaches have in like the athletic space of providing that safety for their athletes, and really I think a lot of it comes down to just caring about the major outcomes, not necessarily just the wins and losses, but how their leadership and the way that they run their team impacts these players that eventually will not play anymore, because as every athlete knows, at some point your career will come to an end, whether you want it to or not. And it's, I think, more about what you can build in that time that will then translate into life. Because, like, as you're saying, these are things that should be implemented in all kinds of organizations. So any person that is going from an athletic organization to, say, a business, if they have that inclusive leadership ingrained in what they have been taught, and that people have cared about them enough to understand the differences, then that's going to trickle down into all those other areas of life, which I think is super important. Like, that's one of the main things that I like to focus on, is building those skills outside of sport. But if there's no model for it, then it's going to be really hard also to try to change people's approach to leadership if you've been so used to having that one size fits all kind of mentality.
Mm. I think it's interesting because I often also think about we none of us would encourage child labor, right? Like I hope none of your listeners think child labor is a good idea. When it comes to sports, we somehow think it's different. And the reality is nobody enters sports, generally speaking, at 50, at 40, at 30, even at 20. And so if you think about how somebody is forming as a person and their early introduction to sports and athletics is during their formative years and their identity, and you're not thinking about how they are becoming as a rounded person, and you're just giving them all this privilege, and they're good at something and their identity's right based around it. We have to think about it in terms of child labor, because it's the only way I can get people to see that it is exploitative, even if they are thriving in it. They're thriving in it because we love to be good at things. We love praise. We love being part of teams. But if you are not taking care of their whole person, you are going to leave them at that point. And that's harmful to the person. It's also harmful to the industry. If we are cycling through young people as they age out, they know that they're leaving at a certain point, but we're using them to entertain people, to provide sports, to represent brands, like all of those things. And then we drop them. And so that isn't much different to child labor. And I just think it's really important from a kind of systemic lens, which is why I'm like, it's worth thinking. If you think of it through that lens, you start seeing that your duty to the performance goes beyond when they benefit you, especially when you think about the fact that they've been groomed or developed, however you want to call it, into sports from a very young age. In any other industry, we would call that child exploitation.
Yeah, and we see that especially with, athletes that have injuries, or when you get out of the sport and then you just lose your value, which I think is so dangerous. Like, I was really lucky when I was, going through my injury, that I had a really supportive family that kind of helped me understand my worth outside of my sport. But if someone has been brought up to believe that the only value that they have is their performance in this sport, as soon as that's taken away, it is crazy how some organizations will have athletes, and if they get hurt or something happens, it's like they are no longer paying your medical bill, or they're now not offering you a scholarship, and they're not helping with anything. And it's like, as soon as you lose that performance value, then you lose value as a person in their
Mm.
eyes, it seems. So I think it's so critical to go beyond that and try to build this identity outside of sport as well, and not only with the responsibility of coaches, but also, like, just hoping that athletes will become more aware of this, because in a lot of situations I think they don't have the support, maybe from a coach or
Mm.
athletic support teams. And maybe it does have to be sometimes the athlete really putting in the work to understand that identity, because you won't always get exactly what you want in that coaching. But I think that leadership role is
Mm.
critical in developing some kind of human being that can function outside of sport well and be thriving, like we've been talking about.
And maybe if I can even add another kind of lens to it, and again, it's the systemic lens, but I think it's important. We know that predominantly men, boys, and then men find their meaning and belonging within sports, right? And we know that at least in Western society, we don't encourage men to be fully formed or rounded people. And we have really high expectations of what they should or shouldn't do. But then in other ways, we don't help them develop their emotional sense of things, their safety and being vulnerable, all of these things. Well, if we think about, like, we have a lot of cases around Europe where people who are men who are involved in sports have had some really serious accusations. Some are prosecuted, some aren't. And if we step back and we think, well, yeah, if we are developing boys, often as well, some of those boys are from marginalized backgrounds, and this is their only hope for them and their family. We're developing them to perform in a sport very early on during development years. Their identity is based around this. They have the same pressures that all men have in society to be a certain way, the same expectations, not necessarily the same sport like supports. And now they get a lot of attention and privilege and power and money from sports. And then in society, and this isn't for all men, but some are harmful and cause harm to people. Some, like, we know there's high rates of suicide amongst particular age groups of men. I think we need to think about sports in terms of this. And if our approach is exploitative, which I would think not intentionally, but often is because we haven't thought about these things, then we're already gearing up men who are already probably not being supported emotionally very well, who probably don't have a strong sense of their identity outside of who, they may be kind of being shaped to be. And then we give them power and identity and focus, and then we take it at some point. Well, that is really harmful. So, like, I think sports has the capacity to be really harmful for women for different norms and assumptions that are focused. But I also think that there's this assumption that it's good for men, and I think it is if you have the right coaches, the right attitudes, the right kind of emotional and personal development occurring in the process, that you're helping them have perspective. But what we do see is, especially famous and wealthy athletes, we see a lot of male athletes from backgrounds of disadvantage for different reasons. But we also see a lot of them, at least in the public's eye, who haven't really been supported to develop as a full person. And so when they lose that identity, they might do harm when they don't have it. That's for anybody with power. But also when they lose that identity, not only were they possibly not supported previously, we've now set them up to be even less supported and have less sense of self. And so from that inclusive lens, we think about how the way we do sports, the way we develop people, may be contributing to harm, and maybe ways to do it that reduces harm. And yeah, I just think it's really important, because we often talk about women in sports, which is really important because we know that there's loads of inherent disadvantages, but we don't always look at how sports was set up originally, and it fosters a approach towards men that is also not helpful for the men or our society, because they have all the baggage of being a man in the world, and then also all of these nuances. So I just think it's worth us thinking about it broadly, because this is not just about benefiting a gender, but understanding the role sports plays in society and the role society plays in sports, and maybe some of those assumptions and norms we wouldn't agree to now if somebody randomly said, I want to take a load of 12-year-olds who might be good at something because they might get college scholarships, because they might want to go to college, they might be good at something, so we'll work them really hard around school. They don't have to be good in school, because we're not going to focus on that if we know they're good at sports and they win games. We're not going to give the additional, like, emotional or social supports that might be required for different people for different reasons. But when they make money, they'll be really glad, because they'll have a name, they'll make money, they'll feel successful, and then we'll drop them when they're around 30. Like, nobody would help me set up that business. I hope. No brand would go. They'd be like, that is not. But we have assumed norms in sports that are so unhelpful, that I just think anyone listening, if you were to question it, everybody can make like a small shift that improves that. And that is really beneficial to everybody, the people, the industry, society.
Yeah. And I think it really is a series of small shifts of leaders stepping up, coaches stepping up and taking initiative. And I think a lot of that is just in building, as an entire person. That doesn't mean that sports are harmful in every sense. Obviously they can provide a lot of really great things, but if those other considerations are not even thought about, then there can be really harmful things. And like I said, in my experience, I was really, really lucky to have a support system at home. But it's not typical with a lot of athletes to have a super supportive exit from sport. A lot of times it's, very isolating, and um, we don't consider the impact that that's having on a person. But when you have such high expectations from everyone around you, and then all of a sudden you cannot meet those anymore for whatever reason, whether it be you are injured or you are no longer eligible to play, college athletics, whatever it may be, there has to be some other way to support those people. And I mean, I'm glad that you brought up kind of the big picture, because it is the small things, but it leads to really, really bad things for all of society.
Mm.
um I want to shift a little bit into talking about some stuff affecting teams,
Mhm.
specifically psychological safety. I know I had the opportunity to learn a little bit more this summer, working with you about psychological safety, and just consider what it could be for teams or athletes in general. So, can you just tell us a little bit about what psychological safety is, and how that might affect team integration?
Brilliant. So I have a little caveat, as always, around psychological safety. It's often talked about as if a person provides it to other people, but it's a co-created experience. And psychological safety is, unlike, we'll say, physical safety, I feel safe that even if people disagree with me, even if I'm wrong, that in this team, I will still be treated with respect and valued, even if there's a disagreement with my position, even if I'm wrong. Um, and that there will be a kind of a attitude of learning towards the conversation, and if I'm wrong. The reason that that's important is if you don't feel psychologically safe, you start hiding things. You start worrying about the thing rather than focused on what you're doing. And there's a couple of things that make me think in a sports context that I think is important around teams. So in Ireland, at least when I was younger, thankfully it's changed. You were allowed to like roar, shout, and swear at like 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds on a sports field, right? And I say that because I was roared and shouted at and swore at. So was both my brothers, and that was normal. There were parents there, and nobody was intervening. We were being shouted at. We needed to, and it wasn't like you need to do better. It was, if you said the words, you couldn't publish the podcast, right? And that was considered normal. Now, we weren't all running around scared of being shouted at or called the names or whatever. Some people might have been. But what it started to do was it would distract us from pleasing the coach rather than focused on our performance. And so that's like a subtle one that can happen. Even if you're not deeply devastated by what's being said, you become more focused on what they think of you because that's what's being centered rather than on what you need in order to perform. Now, if you were impacted by that, and I'm sure people were, we just, I think my brothers and I, we swore at each other enough that we were well used to it. When there was no parents around. And I think so it didn't affect us, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't have. Like when I look around, it did impact other people where they actually felt unsafe to the point where they would stop playing. They would stop attending if that coach was on. Coach was a lovely person. He was motivated by being roared and shouted at as a kid, and he just thought that was helpful. And so that's one example. You can, best case, you become distracted by the criticisms rather than your performance. And worst case is you find a way to avoid all that risk at all, leaving, avoiding the coach, believing that you are worthless because of the things that were said on the pitch in the moment that had nothing to do with really how the coach saw you. So that's one kind of element of it. The other element is within a team, if I don't feel safe, and we know there are, at least from public reports and things within Europe, and I follow some of the American different kind of cases around sports, there is very clear examples that teams might be performing really well together, but are totally psychologically unsafe behind the scenes, right? And you hear things like certain types of hazing that actually were not acceptable. You hear things like assaults occurring within the teams. You hear things like, different types of humiliation or different types of leaking people's personal information or, all sorts. Like I could keep going on, but your listeners know what we're talking about. The issue with that type of setting is that the team might be performing well currently when on performance, but because they're not functioning as a team, and they're not safe as a team, you are missing that additional edge that comes from the intuitive sense of feeling safe and trusting each other, not just on the field, but off the field. And also, in doing that, you're missing the innovative and creative part that I said comes from kind of an inclusive practice. You're missing the ways of improving performance that you can't see because it isn't safe enough for people to risk being wrong or to risk putting their head out or to stand out in some way. And so you hold back your performance. And it makes me think about, there's some examples from really interesting examples of players playing different things where, for instance, I think an American organization, I don't want to say like the brand, went to one of the countries in Africa, one of the areas in the continent, and decided that they found really good players and they gave them all football boots. They thought that was a great thing. It's a brand thing, they're sponsoring it, brilliant. And the players didn't feel safe enough to tell the brand, we don't play with shoes on. Now, this wasn't like a big league. This was a really low league. Actually, to be honest, they were talent spotting. So it was a way of doing that. And because they didn't feel safe, because you can't reject this big brand that's well known, they're American, this whole thing, they took the shoes and they wore them, and there was no talent identified out of that team because they were really playing badly. And nobody considered that historically they were playing in either runners or like less materialed shoes, simply because of the heat, simply because that's what they wore from day to day. It's like it wasn't even I heard a story where one person was even wearing flip-flops, obviously not to the games, but in some of their practices. And because they didn't feel safe telling this big American company with lots of money behind them that wearing these boots would be harmful, they didn't get the talent out of it. But they also didn't understand why they were performing so well. The company got involved and they weren't performing so well. And I think that was about 12 players. And they were identified as like key talent to grow and develop. And initially there was no development identified. They lost out on the opportunity, those 12 players initially, because they weren't actually having those conversations and developing that equality with the players. Later, that's how I've heard about it, it came into fruition when there was an analysis done of the wasted money in this talent scoping exercise. And it was really obvious what the issue was. But because they hadn't built safety, they weren't getting the data they needed to make key decisions. And like I've seen variants of that across other more subtle nuances, but it's the same thing. If your team aren't safe, you don't know what they need. You don't know what helps them. They will regulate what they say. I know some of the feedback from one of the members was, if I had told them, they would have thought of me as a non-professional. That's what they were afraid of, rather than they are assuming the best way to play is this way. And that's the kind of stuff that gets in the way of, like, sports is meant to be about the best, about performance, about skill. It gets in the way when we're not psychologically safe because we're not actually stretching to the best. We just keep repeating what we think works with no real push towards what could be the best today, what could be better now. And so there's some of the examples about how that lack of psychological safety results in not just lower team performance, but also financial impacts, also brand. I don't know if you've been assaulted in a team, if you've had a difficult moment with your team members, and your coach, and I've heard this, your coach says to you, get over it, I'm not getting rid of 10 of them. They're, the 6 of them are the strongest players. You're probably not going to feel very safe in that brand. You're probably not going to encourage people you love to engage with that brand. And at some point, hopefully, you come out, if you are, quieted down like that, you find a way to communicate it so that people are aware of where they're sending their loved ones and what teams they're supporting. So you can't really have good performance without psychological safety, in like sustained good performance. You can have tactical moments where you win. It's not a sustainable approach to performance or winning.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about the risk too, like just the ability to feel comfortable taking risks or being comfortable with being uncomfortable, because in so many situations, especially in sports, the only way to really grow is by putting yourself in situations that are uncomfortable or are, maybe not, your normal so that you can kind of grow in that area. But if you don't ever feel safe to do so and you don't feel supported to do so, then so many people are going to end up taking kind of the safe route and just doing exactly what they know will be, accepted, instead of having the opportunity to try something new, which may end up in a increase in performance, or just learning new skills, which I think is really valuable. I'm interested too in how trust plays a role in this,
Mm.
especially when you have a coach that may be facilitating this psychological safety. And like you said, it's not obviously just one person, like it is a collaborative effort. But how does trust play a role in developing this safety on teams?
Mm. So I think, at least in a sports capacity, I think I'll think about it in that lens because it's slightly different. The trust needs to be that if something is below the standard of how we are with each other, regardless of if you are the best or worst player or the best or worst team member, that standard is required for everyone. And I think that's the first thing we have to be able to trust. The coach has to trust that if something happens between players, that actually somebody who witnessed it on the team is going to report it, and that's not considered breaking the trust of the team. That is considered honoring the trust of the team. And if we think about psychological safety, that's how we have to think about trust. Not, can I trust you to keep my secrets? Can I trust you to privilege me because I'm important in some way and I win you games? But can I trust that there's a standard of conduct that is required here for every single one of us, including the coach? And this is where I think there's a difference between having each other's backs and colluding. And I think in my experience of sports, especially professional sports, and it's not vast, but the professional sports people I've worked with, one of the biggest issues is this idea, and it happens across other industries like in the army, police forces, this idea of the difference between having each other's back and colluding isn't clearly defined. And coaches or senior leaders, that's actually their ultimate responsibility first and foremost, is that line is really clear, that we have each other's back and this is what that looks like. And this is the standard that every one of us meets in order to have each other's backs. And if we don't meet that, it is not a breaking of trust in our relationship to take action on it. In fact, by not taking action, we are breaking our relationship with everyone else on the team, rather than it being this kind of one-way piece. And the only time that I've seen that balance work is if the person in the position of power, like the coach, and it's hard because there's lots of political agendas and pulls, but that standard is so clear that anybody on that team can address it about anybody with them or directly, in a formal or informal approach. And when that's clear and your behavior towards that is really clear, you get the team self-managing trust. And I can trust that these standards will never be gone below. I can trust that if I go below these standards, I have broken my trust with this team, and therefore I will be left accountable for that. That it doesn't matter what pull I have, it doesn't matter how good I am. These are the basic standards for this team. And for sports, and especially for sports, in terms of my points about men who often haven't been supported, in lots of ways, with their own experiences, but also often haven't really had a clear guideline around the standards they need to meet to be part of the team. And that's not men's fault necessarily. It's part of our societal norms. That's actually the ultimate job, I think, of a coach. If you want a psychologically safe, high performing team, there needs to be a standard that nobody can go below. And if anybody enables or colludes with that or hides that, they've broken that trust with the team. And that's the first, and that's the biggest trust, actually. And then you can get into the details of other stuff. But if that isn't there, that's where we see teams, especially sports teams, go wrong. We see that people are using their power of performance, so their position on the team, their privilege because they are considered very good or essential for winning. And whenever that is positioned before the standards of the team, it's very hard to have psychological safety and to enable real trust. Yeah, so I would position it like that. What are your kind of thoughts on that?
I think it's so important for coaches to understand the role that they have on the players, especially in building that environment. Like you're saying, if there's this lack of a standard for basic things, like that, there's a lot of issues with roles too. So I'm interested in your thoughts there. Like I've been working with a team, and one of the activities that we've done is they have each filled out this grid that has roles for all of their teammates, and they get to identify what they see as their teammates' roles. And I think that's so often on teams like such an unclear line, just like with the standard of how do we report this or talk about this, or like how do we navigate that. I think those having those roles clearly set is really valuable. And I know for me as an athlete, like even in high school, I remember thinking like, I have this role, I'm a shooter on my team, and this other person thinks they're a shooter but is not performing well in that area, but there's no understanding on the team of that individual role. And so I think that's an interesting thing to kind of consider,
Mm,
is both of those standards. And then also, even I think trust comes into that too, is trusting that your coach is going to do its best for the team, and then it's not, which again I think there often is political like garbage in sports, which it's hard to get through that. But having the trust that you can also go to your coach and say, this is how I see my role, that, or maybe I think there's an inconsistency in some of these roles on the team, and again that's contributing to that psychological safety, and having the ability to go in and speak these things. But I think often that's not the case, especially with roles. So I'm interested how you
mm.
think unrealistic roles in teams, or just unawareness, I guess, too, could lead to problems, or how coaches or even leaders, if you have a captain on a team, like what is their role in trying to navigate what different players bring to the team and what they contribute.
Mm. I think this is really good because even in team sports, we require people to individually perform to measure them. And we, like your example about the shooter, is really good. It makes me think about I'm really bad. Uh, that podcast We Can Do Hard Things. Is it Abby? She's quite well known footballer, but so she talks about an example of where she was you know, she would know people are coming up behind her. She was aging out. She knew they were being trained for her role, so she had to perform, so there's these, even within the team, there's these competitions. I think if we go back to the original point, like right back to this idea of, if you develop fully rounded people within sports, right? And you are clear that they belong to this team, but they are part of the team, not an individual in the team, if you know what I mean. Like they are not, it's not about just their career. They're, part of the team is their shared purpose. And that they will also have worth elsewhere and in other ways. What starts to happen is people see that they have a role, and then that's something you clarify. I don't like saying, oh, captain should do this because or person should do that. I think the teams have to say, okay, where are we? Where are our strengths? Where are our weaknesses? What are we getting distracted by when performance should be the key? Oh, well, I'm distracted by the fact I want to be a shooter and Natalie is a shooter, for instance. If we can have those conversations and we can make decisions about the team instead of about ourselves, because we have a broader identity, because we know at some point we will age out, because we know that there is going to be more to us than this moment, you do change the level of competitiveness in those moments. And people's desire to belong to the team and to win as a team has more room. But if you've got people who are, and I mean this with respect, insecure because their identity is only being developed through sport, then every time they're on the field, their identity is at risk. And everyone's human. They're going to double down on unconscious defenses, and we're going to get more of that, like stepping into the wrong role, trying to be what you want to be rather than what you are. Not making the best decisions in the moment for the team, trying to center yourself, like all of these pieces. And so, yes, so I think first of all, everybody should talk about it. We should identify, where those risks are and what we want to be. The reason I don't think a captain should be a certain thing is this. You could have someone who's absolutely epic at being a captain, as in they're really good, this is the position they should play, they foster people. One captain might be like loud, direct, expressive. Another captain might be quiet, reflective. That doesn't matter. You know what I mean? We should allow people to fulfill their roles in the way that they can do it. So when we kind of have these stereotypical ideas about who should be a captain, what personality should be, and actually your personality has very little to do with your sports skills. If it did, I'd be a captain of every team, not the goalkeeper, I'd be like nailing it. But the reality is that we should pick the roles based on the contribution on the field to the winning, but we should also be having conversations about aspirations, concerns, preferred ways of leading and influencing, which is that inclusion and uniqueness part. Stop assuming the captain should be the most popular, most skilled, and most kind of like extroverted, coachy, like that has nothing to do with their performance. And if you're adding that to them, you're going to have a lot of people not in captain roles who would be better captains simply because you have a bias to extroversion or a particular way of captaining. So yeah, I think we need to have the conversations, like you said, rather than dictate the roles. But I also think we have to think about the holistic piece to reduce the internal competition and to increase the external competition focus. If you're internally competing, your performance is likely to be reduced because you'll unconsciously put your team at risk. But that can't happen if people aren't being developed as full people and supported to have identity outside of their sport.
Yeah, and I think the role thing is cool. I mean, at least with like what I've experienced with this group individually, is it's cool when you can go and talk to someone about their role and how they see their role in addition to how other people see it, and understand that there may be inconsistencies, but that's where we can look at it and see what needs to change for them to get the most out of it, not because you need to change to be this, but with the approach of like what is your goal here, what do you want to get out of this, because I think that also translates into life. Like if we can understand where someone sees their role and how they see their role in that way, like for example, one of the roles that the coach that I'm working with identified as just one to consider was a cheerleader. Like that is one of the roles on the team, and the fact that he identified that is a role, I think makes it kind of a powerful thing for then people to look at it and see that's a legitimate role on this team. And I think it's cool too to get to be able to talk to players and say like, this is what your team has identified you as. Maybe you don't even see it in yourself, but that's a legitimate role that they see you playing, and there's no one that is more important than the other, because we have to have all of these things to build a successful team. But really diving into what that means for each individual too, like not just, oh, we need you to be this for the team, but also like, this is your personality, this is how you work better, how can we better support you in that to fulfill that role in the best way. So I'm curious too, like I know you've talked a little bit about like the how inclusive leadership is valuing that uniqueness. How can coaches specifically prioritize athletes by meeting their individual needs instead of that one size fits all mentality? Just like with these roles, like it's not just confining to one role, but also defining that role for that person and kind of seeing how it fits individually. So how can we work on that instead of that one size fits all mentality that society often adopts?
Mm. So I think having the kind of conversations that you've just kind of named that your coach was able to adopt, I think the fact that your coach was able to see that cheerleading is part of being on a team, and like positive psychology, sports psychology would tell you that, teams do better when somebody is encouraging within, like a peers. I also think we have to be careful about this idea that the coach has to meet the 12 or the 14 or the 11 different needs. I think if you create a environment, a process of where we consider these needs, then actually team members meet the needs for each other as well. You know, it wasn't actually in a sports context, but I think it would be a really good transference to a sports context. One of the things I've seen done at a meeting, a particular type of meeting, which was usually quite difficult because people had a lot of difficult things happening, was before we got into performance. The question was, what is distracting you? What is worrying you? And this round, like you'd go around everyone and they'd say what was distracting or worrying them. And what would start to happen is the team solvable problems would be solved with the team. But also, even just psychologically, when people were able to say the thing that was weighing them down to the people that they're trying to perform with, they were lighter, and they started to, and that's how they described it, lighter. They were able to focus on performance more. So it's not necessarily about like an individual sheet of questions or, keeping all players happy. Even this is really important. Good coaching doesn't mean everyone likes you or is happy with you, but respect you. And I think the respect piece is what can get missed with inclusion, where people think being inclusive is about being liked. But actually, if I'm going to practice inclusion, I have to be trusted that I will, even if people don't like my decision, that I've made that decision based on things they respect. Even if it's not me, they respect the decision-making process. And I think what coaches can do is they can normalize some of these realities rather than ignoring them. So for instance, if you're coaching a team of women and you haven't considered how the menstrual cycle as a team are impacting you, so you don't have to go to each woman, when are you due? But if you're not saying, right, we know women sink. Are we having sinking? Does that affect our performance? Should we measure that in some way and consider that when we're looking at fixtures and competitions? There's other things people do, which I'm not going to suggest, but there are other things, because some people do control the menstrual cycle for different reasons. So that question is a way of addressing individual needs without going to every individual. You're saying, okay, well, we have a group of women. Do we need to worry? Do we need to worry if people are missing their period due to over-exercising and under-eating? How do we normalize that these things happen, so that we can have the conversations? But I think you start by actually normalizing the individuals in the team discussing it. And then there will be times where coaches step in. There's going to be a lot of times where actually coaches don't step in. And it's the responsibility of the team to think about what they want to do with this, and that's kind of that inclusive approach. But there's a difference between being inclusive and taking responsibility for everybody's needs. It's more that you facilitate a space for needs that are relevant and important in this setting to be considered in decision making, and for individuals to know that it is safe and important, not just safe. If they aren't sharing their needs, they are going to be impacting their performance, and that sharing their needs is part of their responsibility in this team. So it's more than just the coach, but it is normalizing that kind of approach.
Yeah, and I think that's so cool to put some of the responsibility on the other teammates as well, because again, as we're talking about everything translating into life outside of sport, that's a way that you can support others well in your life. I think that's something to consider for everyone, just how learning what other people need and how to meet those needs within your organization, within your team, whatever it may be, how you can take that role. And so just as a teammate, if you notice that one person has a certain need, just stepping in where you can. And again, not taking on everyone's need, because we're human and that's, no one can really, take on that big of a responsibility. But I love the idea of collaboration to make the environment better, because truthfully, if you do leave it completely on one coach or just the coaching staff, I think they're going to miss a lot of things because they're not in the sport doing it, and also that can be incredibly overwhelming to try to manage a lot of different things without any kind of help within the team. I want to give you a chance if you have anything to add before we go into our last question. I think this has been a great conversation, but I want to give you a chance if you have anything else you wanted to add.
Thanks, Natalie. It's been really interesting, and it's lovely transferring some of the learning across to see how performance in business and in sports may have some technical differences, but in terms of dynamics, it has a lot of repetition, which I think we found when we worked together. There's nothing really extra to add, except for, I know I've made some controversial points around men, around women, around child labour. That isn't to criticise sports. Sports is absolutely central for people. But it is to say that we can also question it, because if we really believe in sports and we believe in performance, we believe in the skill and the art, then like we can think about how it could be better, and some of the assumptions it's built on don't set us up for the best experience, the best skills, the best performance, the best entertainment. We could think about that a little bit more so that we do, we do enjoy the sport, but we also see that the sport is an important experience for people, but also it has the capacity to help or hinder. And I'm all for why not use it for helping. So just to be clear about that, I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just having this conversation is really beneficial for bringing some just awareness to some of the things that we can be considering. And that doesn't mean that these changes will occur overnight, but I think little by little, if we can start to just consider some of the impacts of, specific tendencies or norms in sports, that can be really, really helpful for moving forward and just creating a better environment, because I don't think there's any harm in trying to do better in any sense of life. I think that's an important thing to consider for all people, is just how we can improve our lives and what we're involved in. So the last question, the question that everyone gets to answer on this podcast, Sheila, what does it look like for you to live authentically?
I love and hate this question equally, Natalie. So I think for me, living authentically is actually about less of the shoulding, more of the letting people down, being flaky when I'm flaky, as in, when something happens and it's not. Whereas previously, authentically was only, in my mind, was only about me kind of doing the things I love, or, centering those. As I've got older, which I hate to say, I'm thinking that I know I really hate to say it, I think authenticity for me now is becoming more okay with disappointing people in order to honor what I know I need, or what I know is best for me. And that includes all of the things I would have had really strong judgments about. So watching when I think I should be a certain way or do a certain thing. Yeah. And it's kind of knowing that while we can I can take a really certain position on something because I love research and I do a lot of reading and I go down rabbit holes. The authentic part for me is that I can do all that and still know that there's things I don't know, some of which others don't know yet, and some of which they do, and I can listen. So I think authenticity for me is like being sure in myself and holding a position, and also being open to moving that position and being unsure sometimes. I guess less of the splitting, as Melanie Klein, the psychologist, would say, less splitting and kind of more integration is what I see authenticity as.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. This has just been such a great conversation, and I know anyone listening will really benefit from it. And I'm so excited to get to integrate a lot of the things that I got to learn over the summer into what I'm doing now. And I think it's incredible how much similarity there is in a lot, like you said, a lot of the foundational things. So thank you for being willing to share about those things and just your expertise. Thanks for being here.
Excellent. Thanks for having me, Natalie.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We would love to hear what you found valuable in this episode. So please DM us on Instagram at Authentic Performance or leave a review. They're super, super helpful for us. We're so thankful that you're on this journey with us and want to invite you to be a part of the Authentic Performance fam. You can check out more of how we're supporting athletes at theauthenticperformance.com. Also, let us know what you want to hear on the podcast next, or who you want to hear. We appreciate your feedback and want to give you the best possible resources and support. In the meantime, think about how you can live authentically.